Brian set about trying to get the boys a record contract and groomed them for success. No more eating, chatting, drinking or shouting on stage. No more leather trousers or jeans. No more playing whatever they were in the mood for. Brian wanted them clean, punctual and well-behaved. He wanted them to play their best songs every time in an hour-long set. The Hamburg style, stringing songs out to 5 times their length, larking about on stage, and insulting their audience was out. The boys went along with all this because they could see it made sense. Paul was keen on the changes, and George was happy to accept them, but it wasn't easy for John. When Brian asked them to wear suits and ties, John growled for days. That was what the Shadows, the group John most despised, did. John felt it was selling out, that it wasn't what the Beatles were about, but Brian knew it was necessary if they were ever to break out of the Liverpool scene. So John did as Brian asked. He wasn't cajoled or pushed. He did it because he understood Brian's reasoning that if the group were to have mass appeal, they had to be more mainstream. But he rebelled in his own little ways, often leaving the top button of his shirt undone or his tie askew. Pete had always been in charge of the boys' bookings, but now Brian took over. He began to charge venues more for the boys to play and refused to let them appear unless they got the higher fee. Until then, the boys' organisation was haphazard, and they'd take whatever money they were offered. They were often late and had no system for letting each other know where they were due to be. Brian sent them neatly typed lists of their dates and insisted they arrive on time. I enjoyed the new-style Beatles, and despite his grumbles, so did John. He could see that a smarter, cleaner image made sense, as did putting together a performance that included their most popular songs and lasted for a set time. He knew, too, that it was moving him closer to what he really wanted, the all-powerful record contract. By April, another trip to Hamburg was on the cards. This time Brian had done the negotiating, and he'd secured them a better club and more money. They were opening at the Star for the equivalent of £40 a week, more than double what they'd been earning before. He insisted that they arrive in Hamburg in style, by plane. Once again, John and I kissed goodbye. I was used to him going now, but I didn't miss him any less. The only consolation was that I'd have plenty of time to work for my finals, which were looming alarmingly close. John, Paul and Pete flew from Manchester to Hamburg on April the 10th, with George following the next day. When their plane landed, John saw Astrid waiting for them and waved to her. But as he got closer, he saw her stricken face. Stuart had died a couple of hours earlier. From Stuart's letters, John knew that he'd been suffering from increasingly bad headaches. X-rays and medical checks had shown nothing, but the headaches were so bad that Stuart was often unable to move for pain. He would lie in bed with Astrid and her mother looking after him. His family in Liverpool were kept informed. They were terribly worried about him and begged him to come home, but Stuart wanted to stay in Germany with Astrid. That morning he developed such a severe headache that Astrid's mother had phoned her at work to say she was calling an ambulance. Astrid had raced home just in time to go with Stuart to the hospital, but he died in her arms at 4:45 p.m. in the back of the ambulance. The cause of death was later given as cerebral hemorrhage, and Stuart had been 22. While John was in Hamburg dealing with Stuart's death and playing an exhausting schedule, I'd run out of patience with Mimi. I could no longer ignore the tension between us or her bad temper, and decamped to my Aunt Tess, Mum's sister, who kindly took me in. When I told her I was leaving, Mimi was tight-lipped and stalked out of the room. I wrote to tell John, who was more understanding because he knew how hard it had been. My aunt's family were lovely, but they didn't really have room for me, and besides, the secondary school where I was doing my teaching practice was a 3-bus journey away. I began to look for somewhere of my own. I scoured the accommodation pages of the Liverpool Echo and found a bedsit I could afford in a tatty little terraced house reasonably close to college and the two schools where I was teaching. Glad as I was to be independent at last, it was hardly the sweet little home I had visualized. For 50 shillings a week I had a grubby room with a 1-bar electric fire to heat it, a tiny 1-ring cooker, a single bed, an ancient chair, and a moth-eaten rug. I had to put a shilling in the meter if I wanted hot water for a bath in the shared bathroom, and even then the water was barely ankle deep. Still, it was a place of my own, and I was determined to cheer it up, ready for John's return. In early May, while the boys were still in Hamburg, Brian's efforts finally paid off. He'd taken tapes to the big HMV record shop in Oxford Street, owned by EMI. He wanted to get them made into a disc, so he chatted up a technician he knew there. The technician recorded the disc and was so impressed that he played it to a music publisher upstairs, who liked it and said he'd speak to a producer he knew at Parlophone, George Martin. Parlophone was part of the EMI empire, which had already turned the Beatles down. But George Martin, a classically trained musician turned producer, listened to the record and agreed to audition them. He liked John singing Hello Little Girl, Paul singing Till There Was You, and George's guitar playing. Brian immediately cabled the boys to tell them the good news and asked them to rehearse new material. After that, John's letters were full of their excitement. They were writing songs, planning their future, and dreaming of all the money they'd make. George, whose father was a bus driver, was planning to buy his daddy's own bus. They came back from Hamburg in early June, and a couple of days later, on the 6th, they had their audition with George Martin at the EMI studio in St. John's Wood. Neil Aspinall drove them to London, where they stayed at a cheap hotel. The next morning they met up with Brian, who took them straight to the studio where George Martin was waiting. Introductions were made, and the boys, all nervous, played a mixture of their own songs and well-known hits. George Martin said thanks, he'd let them know. All the way home they debated how it had gone. They knew they'd have done better if they hadn't been so nervous. John and Paul felt their voices had wobbled. They just hoped that they'd been good enough to earn themselves a contract. When they got back to Liverpool, they were in a state of high suspense, but there was nothing to do but wait and see. Meanwhile, they had a welcome home night at the Cavern. Brian had lined up plenty of bookings for the next few months. The next few weeks brought a series of momentous events. First, just after I had my finals at Art College, the boys' breakthrough arrived. After almost 2 months of agonizing, they heard that George Martin wanted them to sign a contract with Parlophone Records. We were all ecstatic, and John kept shouting, "This is it, Cyn, this is it. We're going to be making records, we're famous." We laughed, danced, drank, and celebrated. There was just one hitch. John, Paul, and George had agreed that they didn't want Pete in the band. They decided not to tell him about the record contract and asked Brian to fire him. Brian liked Pete and was reluctant to do so, but he accepted that the others felt he was wrong for the group. My heart bled for Pete. I'd grown fond of him, and he was a good drummer, but his face didn't fit. The boys wanted someone they could have a laugh with, someone who shared their irreverent sense of humour. Brian hated having to tell Pete the bad news and offered to try to find him work with another band. Pete sat at home for 2 weeks, unable to face anyone or to understand why the boys he had thought were his friends had dumped him. It was cruel. He had believed he would share the group's success, and his drumming had been part of what had got them that far, but suddenly he was ditched, with no prospects. Even worse, none of the other 3 had the courage to go and see him, apologize, or even stay friends. Pete was closer to John than he was to the others. They'd been friends for 4 years, and was particularly hurt that John avoided him. I urged him to go, but, as ever, he avoided the confrontation. He thought Pete would be angry, and he wanted to avoid a row. It was John at his most cowardly. Without doubt, he, Paul and George could have handled things much better. But were they wrong to do it? I don't think so. They knew that for the group to work, it had to have the right combination of people, and they knew whom they wanted in Pete's place.